That was beautiful. Thank you, choir. Sometimes what we think we want is not what we need. I graduated from college in 1987 and took a position as youth director in Sanborn, Idaho at a Lutheran church. I ended up spending 5 years there, most of it growing up and learning how to function in a mostly middle-class community. I remember spending a lot of my free time by the lake or the river contemplating my future, worried, anxious, afraid. I had no idea where my life was headed. I felt alone. I felt that the world was passing me by. Nearly all of my friends from college had gotten married. In fact, I was the best man at 3 different weddings in 3 years and attended several others. Even though I dated a couple times, nothing really connected long term. But even still, I wanted to be like everyone else. I wanted to get married. I sometimes wondered if maybe I was destined for a life of being single. I imagine my experience was similar to what the Israelites experienced in the time of the judges. They wanted what others had. They wanted a king. God offers freedom and liberation to be ruled by the judges rather than a king, yet in fear and frustration, we often choose the ways of the world. We choose autocracy rather than doing the hard work of democracy. We choose the devil we know rather than the God we don't. 6 times in our reading from 1 Samuel, the phrase, "he will take," is used 6 times. 6 specific warnings. The king will take all these things from you. You will lose your freedom and liberty. But they had convinced themselves that they were headed toward greener pastures. If only they had a king. If only. And yet, we learn later, as Rabbi Nahum Ward-Lev writes, by the end of the 8th century BCE, a time of prosperity in Israel and Judah, by that time, the disparity between the rich and the poor had become even worse than at any time during the time of the judges. In other words, the society that had once embraced God's liberating vision for the world was now headed down toward the road to autocracy and greater disparities of inequity. How many times have we said that to ourselves? If only I had this or that, then my life would be better. If only. There is something about us humans, history teaches, that compels us to be ruled by a king rather than doing the hard work of shared power. It is easier to be told what to do than to have to figure it all out on our own. There is something about us humans that makes us always attracted to the other side, to the better life. But so often when we choose this route, it turns out to be worse. Of the 7 close friends that I remember getting married between the ages of 19 and 24, a time that I wanted to be like them. Only 2 of them are married today. The other five discover that marriage takes commitment and settling down and an added set of rules and expectations that they were not ready for. They were blinded by attraction with seemingly little depth in their relationship. How often do we become blinded by our own inability to see the big picture or to see the ramifications of our choices? How often do we not recognize our own hidden bias? Harvard University has put out a bunch of tests for people to discover their hidden bias. It is called the Implicit Association Test. I encourage you to Google it and test your own implicit bias on a whole range of topics, from Arab, Muslim, to race, to sexuality, to presidents, to weapons. 14 topics in total. A required assignment for students in many of my sociology classes. We so often are unaware of our hidden bias. We become ignorant of our own actions, our words, and how they impact those around us. I remember one of my ignorant actions on one of my early dates with Kathy. I discovered that she loved pistachios. Now, I didn't ever have them while growing up and don't ever remember eating them, but I do like nuts in general. So one night I cooked a dinner for us and made a cake for dessert, without realizing that pistachios needed to be deshelled before eating them. I mixed them into the cake batter with the shell on and baked the cake. When it came time for dessert, you should have seen Kathy's face. She started crunching into all of these pistachios. Needless to say, this was the last day I ever made a cake. Kathy, you won't let me. Our hidden bias and awareness can so easily become our own ignorance when we only allow our emotions or our limited experience to guide us. We see this being played out in our country too. So much bias, so many who would want a king. And here we are again in 2021, repeating history, it would seem. The 1/6 insurrection and attack on the Capitol is the result of a failing democracy and a broken America, to be sure. If only. We know our social reality all too well. A growing economic inequality, wealth concentrated in white communities, the erosion of voting rights, gerrymandering running amok, mass incarceration, increased school segregation, the influence of big money in politics, the devastation done to our planet. And so many Americans want a king to deliver us from these injustices. We are not alone. Authoritarianism is rising throughout the world. We are certainly in a battle for the soul of America and perhaps even the world. This battle is occurring on our doorsteps without most of us paying attention to it. One example of this is how school districts around the country and even Oregon are electing conservative school board members and banning critical race theory from their curriculum. Well, what is critical race theory? I would love to facilitate a deeper discussion on that, but simply put, critical race theory simply attempts to teach history without blinders on, without bias. It is a theory that acknowledges the structural and systemic realities of racism in our country throughout our history. It is a call to recognize issues of power that have led to the haves and have-nots. And yet, every call for equality in our country has been framed by the ultra-conservative right as requiring a loss for the white community. Equality is seen as a threat to those in power. A threat to those in power. And my friends, what does that mean? It means equality is a threat to white people. Think of the way affirmative action is discussed in the public square today, and the way some white folks believe that they are the ones now being discriminated against. We are supposed to be a democratic America. We are supposed to share power. We are supposed to hold up liberty and justice for all, to be a shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan framed it. Yet, political scientists tell us that for the most part, democracies are dying slow, quiet deaths these days. They erode slowly and barely visible steps, according to Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat in How Democracies Die. So how do we respond in this climate of fear and if only? How do we hold on to democracy? We must begin by remembering. Jennifer Butler, in her book, Who Stole the Bible, argues that remembering does three things. It reveals what we want and need to confess. It alerts us to the cycles of history. It helps communities expose the truth and take hold of the future. In doing this, in remembering, we can then use the many examples of history and recommit ourselves to shared governance and building and developing diverse coalitions. An excellent example of this shared by Jennifer Butler is John Lewis. John Lewis did not know when he marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday that he would live to be a congressman, or that the act would lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. She continues, When we dig deep into our history, we learn from the bravery, the strategies, and the shortcomings of those who went before us. Where do we look for the lenses that lead to liberation and democracy? Not for some of us, but for all of us. Dr. King, writing shortly before his death, after the victories that dismantled legal apartheid in America, wrote a book entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" Dr. King writes, First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth. We must then stand up amidst a system that still oppresses, and we must develop an unassailable and majestic sense of values. An unassailable and majestic sense of values. King calls us to be clearer and clearer about what we believe is important, what is spiritually at stake for us. It was a call to remember that what we care about and are enough to risk our lives for is important, and we should know why that's important. Dr. King talked about remembrance as a spiritual discipline. Even before he talked about love or power, he talked about remembrance. We need to talk in America. We need to talk about how to deal with the divides in this nation. We need to talk across. We need to walk across. We need to work across the aisle in whatever way we need to find ways to make common cause. We need to have those conversations, and it won't be easy. I heard a report over the weekend about the money distributed by the federal government in the COVID rescue plan, especially the payments to families with young children, the child tax credits. It is estimated that those payments will cut the rate of child poverty dramatically in this country and leave fewer families living below the poverty level than ever before. I heard that report and found myself applauding the progress. Wow, great news. But then I became angry that we have been willing to leave so many families with so many children behind for so long. And what will we do moving forward? So where do we go from here as a nation, or as individuals, as a church? That depends on our ability to remember. Jennifer Butler reminds us God gave us the spiritual discipline of remembrance to interrupt the dangerous slide into authoritarianism. We must take heed of the historical warnings all around us. We must remember. And we must de-shell the pistachios before putting them in the cake. I am so glad that I waited for marriage until I was the ripe age of 25. sometimes what we think we want is not what we need. I learned that patience is truly a virtue. I discovered a lot about myself and was prepared for the work that was ahead of me for 30 years of marriage. As a church and a nation, God charges us to have historical empathy. We are called to be the shining city on a hill, not ruled by a king, but by and for each other. It is time to live up to that calling. Amen.